Welcome back to Coordinating Clinical Trials. I'm Steve Pope, your instructor. So this week we're going to be talking about site management and sort of the research enterprise and what your role is in all of that as the clinical research coordinator. So I've indicated a couple of the regs here that basically speak to the investigator being responsible for having an adequate number of qualified staff and adequate facilities to conduct the trial and to make sure that everyone is properly trained on the protocol and on other trial related activities. So you're going to play a key role in this because you're probably going to be handling some of the documentation of that training. You may even be conducting some of that training with some of the folks there at your site. So we're going to go over a number of things related to those activities during this lesson. So let's look at our learning objectives. First, we're going to cite the characteristics of a clinical site. Then we're going to discuss key components of a successful site. We're going to describe the business operations of a site. And then finally, we're going to identify basic site SOPs or standard operating procedures. So let's talk about what a clinical site is. There are a number of varieties of clinical sites. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is what I call the independent research site, or sometimes affectionately refer to that as the mom and pop site. And these are smaller sites. They're independent companies. They're usually a doctor who is performing the role of the PI. He probably has some other staff members, he or she, I should say, in their medical practice that are also involved in the research function. So these are usually associated with the doctor's medical practice, and you'll see these, all over the country. The next type of site is the institutional site, which is usually affiliated with a hospital. So you'll see these mostly, and you'll see them in larger cities, but you might see them in smaller towns as well. These are sites that have operations within the hospital itself. There may be one or more principal investigators that work there at the hospital or have privileges at the hospital, and they also engage in research. And then the third type of site is what I like to call the academic site, which is in most cases affiliated with a university medical school. So these would be teaching hospitals where you have a lot of fellows. You also have a lot of staff moving in and out of those. And they do a lot of research because it's an academic site. One of their principal objectives is to engage in research. So you'll find a lot of investigator-initiated trials that occur at these sites, but they'll also do a lot of industry studies for sponsors, private companies, pharma companies, medical device companies, biotech companies. So these are three of the types of sites. So one of the things that you'll begin to understand is there are a lot of site networks out there. These are usually called site management organizations. So in the previous slide, I talked about independent sites. So what happens on a fairly regular basis is that these independent sites, they typically will grow their revenue to about $1 million plus. And, at that point, these sites are usually pretty profitable. So they become a target for the site management organizations to come in and buy them out. It's a good way for the PI or whoever the investors are in the business to kind of get their money out of it. And then they become part of a larger network that might include maybe 10 or 20 sites, and they could be sites maybe in a regional area, or they could be across the country. And normally these sites are going to be very similar. There's not going to be a great deal of difference between one site versus the other in these networks. You also have corporate sites, and these are sites that are owned by contract research organizations, or they're even owned by pharma companies. A lot of times you'll see a lot of phase 1 clinics that are actually owned either by pharma companies or by CROs. But now we're starting to see more just your traditional site that might be owned by a CRO. The company I work for, Icon, we own a number of sites around the country. And they do research the same as an independent site, the same as an academic or an institutional site. They're just owned by a corporate entity. So let's talk about some of the elements that we're going to go over in this lesson related to the research enterprise or the research site. We're going to talk about what's involved in starting a clinical research site, how you would go about preparing a site to conduct clinical trials, promoting your site or networking. That's the activity involved in procuring studies to work on, understanding site selection and feasibility, and then also understanding the regulatory considerations and requirements that you're going to need to be aware of. So let's talk about funding. So if you're going to be starting a clinical research site, you've got to have some money to do that. If you're an independent site, you're probably going to be self-funded by the PI or whoever the owners are of the site, based on the revenue coming from the medical practice. If you're an institutional site, you're probably going to have a budget item in an overall a budgetary process. So you might be given a certain amount of money to get the site sort of up and rolling. One thing you're going to need to think about are facilities. You're going to have a lobby. You're going to have areas where you can do clinical assessments, exam rooms, things like that. You're going to have certain equipment, centrifuges, refrigerators, freezers, storage area, calibration of equipment, those types of things. You're going to need some type of laboratory. So even if you're not actually running the labs as a lab technician would, but you're going to have to draw the labs as part of the trial. You're going to have to package and ship those labs to a central lab, even if it's one that's just down the road, or it could be one that might be in another country. So you're going to need to have the adequate CLIA and CAP certification for that. You're also going to need a few other things, such as a conference room for holding meetings, probably a space for your monitor to work in when they show up, and probably more than one space, because you're probably going to have more than one monitor at a time in some cases. You need to have some type of pharmacy. If you're an institutional site, then you can use your investigational drug pharmacy at your institution. You'll be charged a fee for that. Or you may want to handle the pharmacy piece of it yourself, particularly if it's a study drug that does not require any special storage. Maybe it can be stored in ambient temperature, and it's just going to be dispensed to the subject in maybe a bottle or a box or something like that you can quickly just pull off the shelf and hand to your subject. You can handle the pharmacy piece of that yourself. Investigational products do not have to be dispensed by a licensed pharmacist because it's not approved by the FDA. So you can handle that as a coordinator if the conditions are right. You need to have office space for your staff. Then you've got to have storage space for lab supplies and documentation, and probably some type of external location, because you're probably going to have some overflow of some of those things. So you're going to have a staff of people at your site. You're probably going to start out really small. You're going to have a principal investigator, obviously. You're going to have someone in the role of the coordinator. That person could be a registered nurse, or it could not be a registered nurse. They don't have to be a registered nurse. You're probably eventually going to wind up with some type of regulatory staff, someone who's dedicated to the regulatory piece of it. Probably in the initial stages, the coordinator would handle that. You're probably going to need some sort of lab technician, someone who's going to process lab samples for shipping to central labs. But in the beginning, you'll probably, as the coordinator, probably handle that process as well. Then, as your site grows and gets bigger, you're probably going to wind up adding a data entry person that's going to be responsible for entering all the data. You may wind up with a staff of people who do that. And then finally, you're going to have some administrative staff, someone that maybe one person who can answer the phone and handle certain administrative tasks in the office. So as your research site grows, you're going to experience staff retention issues. People that come on board are going to want to have some sort of career path. They're going to want to know that there's a future working in your clinical site. So, and that's going to be something that's going to be a challenge to manage that. You're going to be somewhat restricted on the amount of salary that you can offer in the beginning, and so eventually, some people are going to come join your site, join your company, and they're going to kind of max out after a few years, and they're going to be looking to earn more money, and they're probably going to wind up going someplace else that's bigger, that can afford to pay more money, that type of thing. So you're going to have some retention issues there related to your staff. So as I said before, obviously you're going to have a principal investigator, a PI. Many sites have principal investigators that maybe work on a part-time basis, and they don't have any other affiliation with that site. They're just a hired staff member. But it's important to understand that your PI needs to have therapeutic experience as well as research experience, training, and these need to be listed on their CV, their curricula vitae. So, because that's what the sponsor is going to look at first to try and determine, does this PI have the level of experience that we're actually looking for on our trial. And then the final item here is you've got your location. So this could be, if you're independent, you might have maybe a rural location, and there could be some real benefits to that. I've been to a lot of sites that were in very rural areas, and they do very well in research because they get a lot of the local population there, many of whom do not have health insurance. And so participating in these trials is one of the ways that they get health care. They get seen by a physician on a regular basis. Plus they get paid a little bit to do the trial. So you might have a rural location, or it could be an urban location. You probably have some of the similar dynamics either way. As I mentioned, some sites are going to be hospital-based, and then some are going to be in academic institutions as well. So choosing a PI, as I mentioned before, that needs to align, the PI's experience needs to align with the therapeutic areas that you're going to be able to participate in at your site. So if you have, for instance, a smaller independent site, therapeutic areas that you're likely to work in are going to be things like pulmonology for, like asthma or COPD therapy. Gastroenterology is one you're probably going to be able to work in. Women's health, psychiatry, respiratory, endocrinology, diabetes, things like that. These will be areas that independent sites will probably find a lot of opportunities in. These will be fairly straightforward, fairly simple trials that you can work on, and they're not going to require all the resources that you might find at a hospital-based site or an academic site. You're going to need to hire, train, and develop staff. So that's going to be a real key fundamental for you. So what type of person do you hire? Probably you're going to be hiring a lot of young people that are just getting started in their career that don't have a whole lot of experience, but they're eager to work and they're eager to learn. And so that's probably where you're going to have your best hiring success. And you're going to need to train them as they come along. So that's going to be very important. Using technology is going to be key, because initially you're probably going to be working with using, say, paper medical charts to start with. You're probably going to be keeping your investigator site file in paper binders, which is perfectly fine. But eventually you're going to want to invest in some technology, and there's a lot of it out there. For instance, technology that handles your investigator site file that you can put out there and use a technical solution for. There are a lot of products out there, such as Florence, such as Realtime, Complion, VivaVault, and you can go look these up and kind of see what they look like. So using that technology is going to help you manage your trials a little bit better and cut down on so much of the use of paper. You may eventually use some type of electronic medical record, although if you're independent, more than likely you would not do that. However, you might use some type of eSource product for compiling all of the data and collecting the data for the trial. And there are a number of them out there. Creo is one. There are others that you can set up as an electronic means of collecting the data that then is going to be entered into the EDC system at the site, so that the sponsor gets their data collected. So let's talk about budgeting. You want to make sure that you get paid for what you do. So when you get your protocol and you start discussing the contract and budget with either the sponsor company or the CRO, you want to make sure that you're getting paid for all of the various assessments that you're doing. We went through a budgeting process, earlier in this course, so I hope you got something out of that. You want to also secure trials to work on, and you want to ensure your success for that. So you want to be kind of careful that you choose trials that are going to be, you're probably going to succeed at. That means not only the trial itself, but the therapeutic area. And you also have to take into account your recruiting, your subject recruiting capability. If a sponsor expects you to recruit, say, 20 subjects, and you're not able to do that, then that's going to impede your success on it. So you're probably going to have to do a little trial and error to kind of see how that works. Also, writing standard operating procedures and why they're important. Eventually, you're going to have staff turnover. You're going to have additional staff that come on board. So as many processes as you can document, and we're going to go over that in a little bit later, will help you in your growth factor, so that you have everything as clean as possible. So in these next couple of slides, I'm going to show you some examples, or some titles, I should say, of site SOPs that are typical at each site. So, for instance, you would have an SOP on how to handle study essential documents and how to do trial master file and preparation and maintenance of study files. This would be your investigator's site file. Who is supposed to file it? Do you keep an electronic copy? In some cases, you want to do that even if you're working with a paper trial or investigator site file, because there are going to be some documents that are going to be unique to the trial, but then there are going to be others that are not unique to the trial. For example, your medical licenses, your CVs, your GCP certificates. Those are things that are going to have an expiration date. And so, my best recommendation is to keep those separate from your trial investigator site file, because that way they're easier to maintain. And also keep an electronic copy of those, because your monitor is going to come in and they're going to want to say, hey, Dr. So-and-so's medical license has expired. Do you have the current one? You can say, yeah, we have that, and you can email it to them. So that makes things a lot easier. So documenting that process will help facilitate things a lot. Site initiation visits. That's when a monitor is going to come out and basically provide training for your site to get started and to get activated in order to start screening and enrolling subjects. You'll want to have an SOP on investigator meetings. That's when, prior to the study beginning, pharma companies like to have investigator meetings, sometimes in fancy locations, sometimes just remote, where all the investigators can kind of get together and they can share all the information at one point with everybody. The informed consent process. How does that work at your site? Who does what? Do you allow the subject to take the informed consent document home with them and share it with family members so that they have a good chance to read through it? Sometimes these are lengthy documents that can be 25, 30 pages long, and that's quite all right if you give it to them and have them take it home. That's fine, but document that in your process. Who's going to do IRB submissions and continuing review? CRF completion and data entry. What's your process for doing that? Is there a specific person who does that? Are the coordinators doing that? Who's doing it at your site? And then what's your process for sponsor monitoring visits? Some sites like to limit the time that the monitor can be there, either on a daily basis or a multiple daily basis. For instance, you might have core monitoring hours that are from, say, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., which is pretty typical. You might have a policy where if a monitor comes, they have to wait a certain period of time before they can come back. Those kinds of things kind of help you manage that process a little bit better. Some of the processes include correcting data entry errors and source document errors. How do you go about doing that? Who does it? What's the method for doing it? Privacy and confidentiality of study materials. Are they kept under lock and key? Are they readily available for whomever in the office needs them? That type of thing. Adverse event recording and reporting. That's really important. So how do you record those? Do you record adverse events on a log, and then you circulate that log to the principal investigator for the principal investigator to assess causality and severity on that? Or do you do it in some other fashion? Who reports that? Who reports serious adverse events to the sponsor? How's that done? Also, receipt and handling of investigational product. This is very important because you're going to get investigational product in, and one of the first things you're going to need to do is to take inventory of that product, record that IP on the accountability log, and then check it in to the IWRS system. So a detailed process on who does what with that, and more specifically what the time frame is. Because if you let that sit there for longer than about a day, somebody's going to be calling you and trying to find out why you haven't checked it in yet to the IWRS system. So if the person who does that is on vacation, for instance, who does that? Who backs up that person and does it when they're not in the office? So that needs to be documented in your SOP. Investigational product accountability. This is very important. You need to have a process for who does what, who records IP, who takes down all the accountability features in IP accountability. Who's recording, for instance, when the subjects bring back their IP and they've got unused IP and you're going to record that on the accountability log. Is that done by a coordinator? Is it done by a pharmacy person if you're at an institutional site? Do you record that on paper using a paper log? Do you use an electronic accountability product such as Vestigo or Velos? Is that used at your pharmacy? And then someone in the pharmacy does that. So explaining how that's done is part of your SOP. Preparation, handling, and shipping of lab samples. That's important because you need to know who's going to do what and in what time frame. For instance, if you have frozen samples, which many PK samples are going to be shipped frozen, so you got to put them in a freezer and keep them there for a while. How long do you keep them there? When do you ship them out? The person that does that needs to have the appropriate IATA training in order to do that, and they have to have a certificate for it. So you got to keep track of that. Meetings and communications with sponsors. This probably sounds like a simple thing, and it sort of is, but you want to make sure particularly how you store that. Do you keep a communications log? Do you just print out copies of emails and put them in a binder? How do you do that? Just document the way of doing it. How do you keep track of study meetings and meeting minutes? Who does what? So what's your process for study closeout? How do you handle it? Where do you store documents? Retention and archiving of study documents. One of the things that's going to occur at your closeout visit when your monitor comes is they're going to want to know, do you archive documents in another location? And if so, they want to know the address of that location and maybe who the responsible party is at that location. So make sure you have that documented, that you can just hand to them. Say, after 2 years, we move everything to this location. Here's where it is. Preparation for audits and inspections. That's very important because you're going to have some of those. So who does what? How do you prepare for them? Then finally, responding to serious breach events. This is something that's becoming a bigger issue in clinical trials. These are breaches of privacy, breaches of confidential information. How do you handle that? Who gets notified? What the process is for doing it. So now we get to the point where we're ready to promote our site. We're ready to do some networking. So how do we go about doing that? Because we want to get work in, and it's not going to just automatically come to us. So one of the things you may want to do is participate in professional development organizations. For instance, there's a Society for Clinical Research Sites that you may want to join, and you may want to participate in some of the events that they sponsor. That's a good way to make yourself known out there. Creating a website for your site, particularly one that's got some type of registration tool for interested participants. That's a good way to begin collecting contact information for possible patients, possible participants that can enroll in your trials. You're going to have industry contacts such as contract research organizations, CROs, pharma companies. There's going to be therapeutic networks out there that a lot of the doctors will participate in. And that's a good way to promote your site and make sponsors aware of what your capabilities are. So let's talk about site selection and feasibility. So once you get everything rolling, you're going to have to go through the site selection process before you're going to be able to work on a trial. So you need to understand, first of all, why are sites selected and not selected. Normally what happens is you're going to receive what's called a site recruitment questionnaire, which is just a series of questions. It's a survey, if you will, and you're going to fill that out. You're probably going to do it online. And then that's going to go back to the CRO for them to review. So they're going to be looking at things like, what's your experience in the therapeutic area? What's your capability to enroll? Those types of things are probably two key areas. Then once they have a chance to review that, the next thing that will happen is you're going to have what's called a pre-study site visit or a feasibility visit. So a monitor is going to come out and they're going to spend a few hours with you. They're going to kind of assess. You can show them around, show them what you have there at the site. They're going to talk a little bit about the study and make sure that you've got all the capability to perform that study, and ask what experience you have performing similar studies. So that's going to be part of that pre-study site visit. Then we'll talk about how to make your site more appealing. So as I mentioned before, therapeutic experience is important. Also, demonstrating that you have been a successful enroller in past studies is also important. And your ability to enroll large numbers of participants to meet what the sponsors' requirements are. For example, in a COPD study, they might want to have you, hey, can you enroll 10 to 15 subjects? For sites that have done those types of studies in the past, that would probably not be a problem for them to do that. Vaccine studies, on the other hand, they might want you to enroll 100 subjects. That would not be unusual for a study like that. So whatever the requirements are, you need to be able to make sure that you can meet their expectations on that, and that can be part of the selection process. So usually the first thing that occurs before just about anything is you're going to have a signed confidential disclosure agreement that the PI is going to sign, that just basically says that we're not going to disclose any information we learned from you. You have to provide us with certain confidential information in order to do your assessment. So we'll agree not to disclose that. You're also going to want to know whether or not they're going to want you to use an IRB that is local, or if you can use a central IRB, which most sites usually don't have a problem with either one. But then eventually you're going to have a signed contract between the sponsor and the site that details what each one is going to do, and usually contains the budgetary information as well. So let's talk briefly about patient recruitment and retention, because that's going to be a key component to the selection process. So the more avenues you have for recruiting patients is going to be really important, and it's going to be really important to make the sponsor aware of that during the site selection process. So your use of social media, your use of physician referrals, any community outreach that you might engage in, any patient advocacy groups that you might belong to, those are all important. Also, any flexible scheduling. For example, if your site is open on Saturdays, that can be key. If you're able to provide transportation for the subjects. That's a key area. Any portals or, I mentioned earlier having some type of registry is important where people can sign up and indicate their interest in participating in the trial. And then also, what kind of regular follow-up do you generally do with your participants, with your subjects? Because this will be key, because if you're working on trials that might last for a year, the sponsor is going to want to know, well, how often are you contacting these people? Because there could be a month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks in between visits, and they want to know, what are you doing to retain interest with those subjects so you don't lose them and they wind up being lost to follow-up. So improving your site's efficiency can be things such as having dedicated study teams. In the beginning, you probably wouldn't have dedicated study teams, but as your site grows, you'll have more and more people there, and so you want to make sure they're adequately deployed on different studies. You want to keep track of key performance indicators such as enrollment rates. What's your answered query rate? The sponsor is going to want you to answer queries within 5 business days. Can you do that? Has that been a problem for you on other studies? What about protocol deviations? How many do you have? What's the nature of those deviations? Are those deviations considered important deviations? Were they deviations that were required to be presented to the IRB? These are all key elements, key indicators that you want to keep track of at your site. You want to centralize your documentation as much as possible. Use of electronic trial master files or electronic investigator site files. How do you do your record storage? All of these things are things that as you grow, you're going to become more efficient at, and that will improve your site operation as you go along. So we got several reading assignments that are going to amplify what I've gone over in this particular lesson. One of them comes from your textbook. The others are posted on Blackboard. These are readings that I think will help you improve your understanding of your role in the site management process. So for your discussion forum assignment for this week, I put an SOP document template out on Blackboard for you. So using this template, I'd like for you to write up a short SOP for one of the tasks that we discussed in this week's lecture, or if you want, you can come up with one of your own if you like. The template should explain for you what information should be contained in each section, and then once you've done that, post your document on the discussion forum. For most of you, I think for most of these processes, this document is probably going to be about maybe 1 page, maybe 2 pages. It's not going to be it should not be any longer than that, I don't believe. But I'd like you to take seriously the assignment and work on that, and go ahead and post that to the discussion forum when you're finished.